Hi, Mrs. Colgan here. We're starting on page 251. Actually, started isn't really the right word. It didn't come on like rain usually does, a little at a time, until first you realize that you're feeling a drop or two, and then you realize it's more than a drop or two, and then you know you need to get someplace because it's really going to come down in a minute. Here, 1 second it was all ascending sparks, and the next it was all rain. It must have been something like the moment the doors closed on Noah's Ark. We threw our wool blankets over our heads, but it was already too late. We held the blankets tight around us as a cold wind dropped down with the rain, and while every single seventh grader from Mrs. Baker's class was hollering and trying to keep already soggy sleeping bags from getting a whole lot soggier and asking if snakes come out in the rain, Danny and I loaded more wood onto the fire to keep it from going out. And that's pretty much what we all did for the rest of the night. Hollered and wrung out sleeping bags and kept throwing wood onto the fire, except for Mrs. Baker, who went inside the tent with Mrs. Sidman. When dawn finally came, which we were all ready for, let me tell you, every bit of ground around the campsite was wet. Every bit. Puddles everywhere. It squelched while we walked, though sometimes it was hard to tell. Sometimes it might have been our sneakers squelching. Mrs. Baker came out of the tent and looked at us with half-closed eyes. "Awfully soggy, isn't it?" she said. Why is it that when teachers go on campouts, they have tents? Mrs. Sidman came out with a dark green poncho that covered her head and reached down to her ankles. She looked around the miserable campsite. We all had mud up to our knees, and most of us had draped our sleeping bags on pine branches above us, water dripping from their corners. "You look like refugees," she said. "Perhaps we should move toward breakfast," said Mrs. Baker. Mrs. Sidman nodded. "You used a lot of wood last night," she told us. "I'll find the eggs," said Mrs. Baker. That morning we had scrambled eggs spiced with pine bark, which came from the sticks we used to stir them. The orange Kool-Aid we drank was muddy because the rain had stirred up the river before we filled our jugs. The bread was soggy, so we dripped honey onto the slices and rolled them, and they didn't taste too bad. Mrs. Sidman warmed the rest of the chili over the fire again, in case anyone wanted it. Only Doug Switek did, which was a mistake, as it turned out. I think if it had kept on raining, we would all have gotten it under Mrs. Sidman's poncho and walked back home. But after Merrill Lee and I had carried all the pots to the stream, we waded right on in with them. Since we were wet through already, the clouds started to shred and sunbeams slit through. Each beam stabbed at the cold winds until one by one they whimpered and died. The whole sky grew yellow, and we threw off the wet blankets. Nothing smells worse than a wet woolen blanket, and then squelched around the campsite, gathering more wood for the day, until suddenly it was so warm that someone said, "Let's go swimming," and we all ran a little way down the paths to the latrines and put on shorts and came back to the water and stepped carefully in. It was still cold, until Danny finally let himself slide down with the high current and over the waterfall ledge and into the pool. When he surfaced, he was laughing and snorting with water up his nose. "It's great," he said, and so we all went over the waterfall and got water up our noses, even Merrill Lee, even my tea, holding Merrill Lee's hand. That's what we did most of the morning while Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Sidman stood above us and watched. I could tell that Mrs. Baker was wanting to try it. It was probably getting hot on the open rocks above the falls, with the sun coming straight down now. Everything in the woods around us was steaming and glistening. The ferns, the pines, the leaves, the moss, everything, even the teachers. It's got to be hard to be a teacher all the time and not jump into a pool of clear water and come up laughing and snorting with water up your nose. We ate lunch, chicken salad sandwiches and cucumber spears, which didn't need utensils, and then we headed back to the water where Danny was throwing dives that the rest of us tried to match but couldn't. He could flip 1.5 times and land head first right where the falls hit the pool, disappearing into white spray. Once he got around 2 full turns, which no human being should be able to do, and came up laughing and snorting so hard he could barely breathe. That's all we did most of the afternoon, not a diagrammed sentence in sight, swimming and diving in a waterfall through the heated hours, until finally we came back up to the campsite and Mrs. Baker started to assign our chores. Now, you have to understand that we'd been there for a day and a half, and in all that time, Doug Switek hadn't followed the gentleman's sign and used what was over the 2 ridges. It was pretty clear he wanted to. Actually, it was very clear he wanted to. But he wasn't going to use a hole in the middle of the woods, he said, even if he had dug it himself. Still, when you've eaten chili the night before and chili for breakfast, you can't hold it off forever. Even Doug Switek knew that, and that's why he finally gave in. He didn't have any choice. He was gone for a long time. No one said anything, but everyone watched down the path. And no one was surprised when he came back smiling, which you can understand. He probably had no idea what found him and what was now following him. Even we couldn't tell. "It looks like smoke," said my T, "but it's following him," said Danny. Mrs. Baker sighed. "It's not smoke," she said. "It's mosquitoes," I said. Mrs. Baker rolled her eyes. We all ran. Doug Switek couldn't figure out why until the first ones landed on him. He looked down and saw his arms covered. That was until they flew into his eyes. Then he ran too, and probably hit a whole lot more trees than he would have if the world was a fairer place. The mosquitoes followed us like little airplanes. You could hear them buzzing. We ran down to the water and splashed at them. They hovered above us and laughed. We ran toward the woods and swatted at them with pine branches. They laughed some more. Then we ran toward the fire, since Mrs. Baker said they hated smoke. They don't. Hiding in the smoke helps about as much as scrunching under a desk during an atomic bomb attack. "Keep moving and stay in groups," said Mrs. Baker, which is the same strategy to use if you're floating in the ocean and surrounded by sharks. It means that anyone on the outside of the group gets picked off. So we took turns getting in close to the center, except I gave Merrill Lee my turns and she had helped me with the pots. She said that I saved her about a pint of blood, which was worth it the way she smiled at me when she said this. And that's how Mrs. Biggio found us when she hiked in at dusk, all huddled into small groups, swatting hopelessly at hordes of mosquitoes, nothing cooking on the fire. Mrs. Sidman was in the tent with the entrance zipped up. Mrs. Biggio unslung her backpack, whipped out a can of insect repellent, and went to work on us. Then she loaded wood onto the fire and sent half of us out for more. "The rest of you, bring me 3 large flat stones from the river and scrub them clean. And bring back 2 pots of water, too. Who's been cleaning these?" When we came back with the stones and pots of water, she unloaded garlic and carrots and potatoes and turnips and chuck beef and tomatoes. My T stared at it all. "Tit beaucoup?" she asked. "It will be by the time we're done," said Mrs. Biggio. "The curry and ginger root are in the front pocket there. I couldn't find any lemongrass, so we'll have to make do." She and my T made do. In a little while the water was boiling, and they had chopped up the potatoes and turnips into one pot and the chuck beef into another. And then they combined them and added everything else that Mrs. Biggio had brought. And if there wasn't any lemongrass, it all smelled as wonderful as any food cooked over an open fire can smell, which is pretty wonderful, let me tell you. Just as we saw the first star, Mrs. Biggio and my tea ladled the stew out into bowls that Mrs. Biggio had packed and gave us spoons that Mrs. Biggio had picked up all along the trail. "You can never be too careful about your supplies," she said to Mrs. Sidman, who, because she was eating hot titbit was happy enough not to blame anything on me, even though I still was the one who carried the pots down to the stream to clean them out, with Merrill Lee. And neither of us minded at all. We were still there when Mrs. Biggio and my tea came down to wash Mrs. Biggio's cutting knives, which she wouldn't let anyone but my tea touch. And when Mrs. Biggio said to my tea that she had meant to be up to the campsite earlier, but that she had taken the morning to speak with the Catholic Relief Agency that had sponsored my tea when she came from Vietnam. She wanted my tea to know that the house where she was living with the relief sisters was very nice, but if she wanted, that is, if my tea would like to, Mrs. Biggio had a small house, and she was living all alone now, and she thought that maybe, if my tea could ever imagine that, until my tea put her arms around Mrs. Biggio, and Mrs. Biggio put her arms around my tea, and the ripples of water replaced all the words. Good Lord for alliance! That night, I lay awake. It seemed that the soggy ground had sunk down and left a whole lot of rocks to poke up into me. I watched the bazillion stars amaze the sky above. I watched until they fell asleep themselves, half my mind on sea, half on shore, thinking about my tea and Mrs. Biggio, and Lieutenant Baker coming home to Mrs. Baker, and Danny Hupfer getting ready for his bar mitzvah, and Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., and how in 5 years I'd have to register for the Vietnam draft, and how the dew was starting to soak into my sleeping bag. So I was still awake when the dawn started to think about showing herself. The air was coloring everything gray, and the fog was coming up from the ground in white shreds and billows, as if the whole campsite had lifted itself up into the clouds overnight. I slipped out of my dewy sleeping bag and walked through the white and gray to the water. When I reached it, the stream rippled happily, as if it had been waiting just for me all this time. I knelt down and lowered my palm into it. Cold, frigidly cold, but I rolled up my pants and waded in. Beneath me, the rocks of the stream bed felt smooth and slick, even soft, as the water rushed past, carrying itself away. Then I looked upstream. The disk of the sun had just come up, and the billows of fog had bowed to it and backed away. The river was a sudden ribbon of silvery light, flickering and sparkling and flashing, carrying the new light on its back all the way down from the high mountains. It was so bright that you couldn't see below the surface until the water was right up to you, and then it was suddenly clear and buoying me up in its rush. And it never stopped, this rush of bright water from the mountains, these flashes and chunks of light from the sun. There was so much of it to come. I didn't tell anyone about the river that morning, not even Merrill Lee. I think that if I had told Pastor McClellan, he would have said it was a vision. I think if I had told Mrs. Baker, she would have said that it was a miracle, that all dawns were miracles, miracles being much on her mind lately, as you can understand. I think that if I had told Shakespeare about the river, he would have said, "All this amazement can I qualify?" But he would have been wrong, since what I saw was something more beautiful than has ever been written. But I didn't tell anyone.